Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Mike. I was an additional designer on the Daggerheart core rulebook. These streams represent only my own views and not those of anybody else. I don't do these on behalf of any company, right? These are not Darrington Press or Critical Role products. This is me talking about the game from my own personal perspective. Hello, Sangre00. Thank you for following and thanks for being here. Today, we are going to talk about countdowns in Daggerheart. Those of you who are familiar with Power by the Apocalypse or Forged in the Dark games may be familiar with the use of clocks for tracking objectives and various things in TTRPGs. Countdowns overlap hugely with clocks because of like how they operate, but countdowns in Daggerheart have their own particular manifestations that they utilize, and so I'm going to be talking mostly about those, but a lot of the advice that I'm going to give and my perspective and opinions will also apply to something like clocks or tracks in the Wildsea RPG by Felix Isaacs. So take that and keep that in mind as I talk about various things. As we can tell here, right, we've got the CGL stuff going on. I will be referring to the SRD for a little bit of the stream today, and so I've got those up. The first thing to do with countdowns is if you have a core rulebook of Daggerheart on hand, you can pull open page 162, which has a lot on countdowns. The SRD, as it does in many places, has the kind of condensed version of this information. That's what we're going to refer to in a couple of places when I want to put up a chart that I should just use the chart from the SRD. But the core rulebook has a lot more information. I'm going to go over some of the material that's covered there and then dig into some analysis and some tips and tricks and other thoughts about how countdowns operate. So if you've already read the core book through a few times and you feel like you've a basic understanding of countdowns and you want some more advanced information, just hang on tight as I try to cover the bases and we'll build from there. So some basic terminology for countdowns so that we're all on the same page. Activate is the moment when a countdown enters play or is revealed or begins, like it hits the table and it's going to start counting down, right? It is an active countdown. A countdown advances when the value changes, right? It may advance ticking down, right? A countdown goes down from whatever the number is towards 0. You might change the status of a countdown by increasing it. Normally, the game language in the book is to say advance. I will often say tick down because I'm coming from a world with clocks. And you also have like countdown and tick down dice, right? In Magic the Gathering, people have a countdown d20. So, or a spin down, I guess is the more technical term. So understand there that I may switch between more official and less official language. A countdown, when it's introduced, if it is a standard countdown, it will just advance every time the player characters take an action roll or make an action roll. Other countdowns, dynamic countdowns, will tell you when they advance. So advance whenever the PCs roll with fear, or advance every time this adversary takes the spotlight. And then a countdown triggers or takes effect when it reaches 0. So language around a countdown might say, when this triggers, all creatures within very close must make a strength reaction roll or something, something, something. So a countdown advances toward the ending, it activates when it begins, and then it triggers when the countdown is completed by hitting 0. As I said before, a standard countdown is one that advances one time each action roll that the player characters take. Not reaction rolls, but action rolls. That is a standard countdown. This is more like a metronome timer that is, okay, in 4 actions, this thing is going to happen. And it will just advance one time each time that the player characters make an action roll. That is good for, like, reinforcements are going to show up in 3 actions, or this lava spout erupts every 2 actions, right? So effectively every other, right? Because you go 2 to 1, 1 to 0. Those standard countdowns are more consistent within an overall scene, but you can also have dynamic countdowns that advance up or down only at specific times based on distinct factors or criteria. So an adversary feature that is a dynamic countdown might say every time a PC rolls with fear, this countdown advances, right? And so that is a countdown that scales and is paced based on how often the player characters are rolling with fear. You can use a dynamic countdown as like a tug of war, where you set a countdown at maybe 3 and you say, okay, this countdown represents the crowd's allegiances. And if you can get it down to 0 and trigger, you will have fully gotten the audience, the crowd on your side in this argument. But if the countdown goes up to 6, your rivals will have fully won over the crowd. This can be fun for when you need to do like a back and forth tug of war, but having a countdown that can go down and up under different circumstances also has the potential of kind of getting stalemated and never resolving. So there are other ways that we can combine or utilize countdowns to track more complicated situations. And for that, we look at some of the dynamic countdown subtypes. So the 2 big ones are progress countdowns and consequence countdowns. A progress countdown is a countdown that enters play and activates when the GM says, okay, this is going to take a countdown to complete. It might be, here's a progress countdown 4. You advance this by making actions toward trying to navigate your way out of this labyrinth. And when you make rolls that would help you make progress toward getting out of the labyrinth, then the results there will apply to this progress countdown. A consequence countdown is a countdown that ticks toward something bad happening. So the GM might put a countdown out that says, this countdown 4 represents the faint divinity's patience. And while you're trying to convince them to do something, anytime you have a consequence on a roll, or if I feel like spending fear, then I can apply that toward this consequence countdown. And when it triggers, something bad is going to happen. A progress countdown, the player characters are trying to advance toward some objective that they have. And a consequence countdown is a countdown that the player characters are generally trying to avoid ticking down, because when it triggers, something bad will happen. You can use linked countdowns, a progress countdown linked to a consequence countdown, where they are placed next to each other, and any rolls in the scene that apply toward this kind of racing countdown, the results of that action roll will apply to one or both of these countdowns. Here is where we are going to jump over the SRD. And we can see here that we have this dynamic countdown advancement chart. I'm going to scroll down a little bit to bring it higher in the page. So a progress countdown advances when you succeed with fear, hope, or with a critical. And a consequence countdown advances on failure with fear, failure with hope, or success with fear. Notably, a countdown, both progress and consequence advance when you roll a success with fear. And what that looks like is whichever of the consequence or progress is closer to triggering kind of gets a relative edge, because as both countdowns go towards 0, the one that's ahead will finish first if they just keep ticking down by 1 each. So if I had a progress countdown and a consequence countdown that were linked, the progress countdown is convince the faint divinity to extend their protection to the town. And the consequence countdown is you have exhausted this divinity's patience and it's going to lash out at you. So I might set the progress countdown at 6 and the consequence countdown at 3. And tell the players, hey, when this consequence countdown hits 0, when it triggers, you're not going to lose this opportunity forever, but a bad thing is going to happen. Or you might say, this consequence countdown is the divinity's patience. When it triggers, the divinity will just leave wherever you were in the conversation. But if they leave and you haven't secured safety or protection for the town, you didn't get what you wanted in this scene. And when you have those linked countdowns, anytime the player characters make a roll toward this situation, you look at what the result is, and then you're going to advance one or both of these countdowns. So if the player characters roll and bring an offering to this divinity saying, here is an offer in good faith to show you that we're serious about this partnership, and they present the offering maybe with a presence roll, and they get a success with hope. Well, that means that you would tick down the progress advancement clock by 2 steps. A 6 would go to a 4. If they got a critical success, it would be a tick down by 3, right? 6 to 3. You'd complete half of it just in one great roll. But if that roll is a failure with hope, progress does not advance, and the consequence countdown advances by 2. So a failure with fear is the worst, where the consequence advances by 3. Critical success is the best, where progress ticks down by 3. And then if you get a success but with fear, both progress and consequence advance by 1 step. That's the kind of basic, most fundamental information. I'm going to talk some about other uses for countdowns and revisit some of the uses for countdowns that are important. And then I'm going to talk about some special countdown rules that you can utilize to be able to use countdowns in different ways. And then how GMs use countdowns for their own stuff versus how GMs might use countdowns in a given scene to represent something that's like an imminent or present challenge. And if you all have questions about countdowns along the way, go ahead and drop them in chat. If you are watching on YouTube later on and you still have questions after watching the video, you can go ahead and add those in comments, and I'll get to them as soon as I can to the best of my ability. So what do we use countdowns for? For me, the biggest one is you use a countdown to measure and represent progress toward some objective or a timer on some bad thing that's going to not happen immediately. So this is an objective that would take more than one successful action to complete, a ticking clock towards something bad happening, a timer on adversary features that need like a wind up or should happen only intermittently. So a dragon's breath might refresh on a countdown, and that's in fact how the game does it with at least one of the dragon adversaries. And what that would look like is a countdown that when it triggers, then the dragon's breath happens. You might also have an ability where you can use it, but then once you use it, you have to start a countdown. And then only when that countdown triggers can the character use the ability again. So there's a few different ways of deploying countdowns as a tool for tracking pacing and timing within a scene. You can also, as a GM move, in a lot of situations, think about whether to advance a bad countdown. Okay, so I had a consequence countdown, and right, they got a failure with fear. I advanced that countdown based on that chart, a failure with fear. But if I have a standard countdown and then a player rolls a failure with hope, maybe, depending on the situation, I might tick down that standard countdown by 1 as the GM move that I make, because it's not a hard move. It is putting progress towards something that will create future badness. Now, if that countdown is at 1, advancing it one more time does create a larger move, a harder move in most cases, many cases, but ticking it down by 1 on its own, in many cases, is a softer move. And I'm being more general here because countdowns are really versatile and you can use them in a bunch of different ways, right? The countdown in a scene might be the mage realizes you've pickpocketed them and it's on a standard countdown, and then as a consequence I advance it so that the mage realizes it more quickly. The countdown might also be the volcano erupts, right? That's a much bigger, larger scale deal that is a threat to a bunch of people versus somebody realizes they've been had. And they operate at different scales and often at different on different time scales as well. I'll talk about long-term countdowns in a few minutes. Countdowns are used a lot in traversal and sometimes also in exploration environments, but you can use them in any type of environment. You might use a progress countdown in a traversal environment to say, this is going to represent your overall journey through this environment or to your destination, right? You make rolls toward progressing that countdown. You might use it in an exploration countdown, an exploration environment to measure progress towards solving a mystery or gathering information or like gathering up the different resources you need from a place to accomplish your goal. In a social environment, you could use a countdown to measure somebody's patience or your progress toward making an argument or successfully lobbying some faction to do a thing that you're asking them to do. And then event environments have a lot of ways where you could use them, right? They can be timers on some recurring thing that happens in the event, or it could be a countdown toward when this event is replaced by another event environment in like a phase change. Again, a great use of countdowns in Daggerheart is to abstract and keep track of an obstacle that would be tracked or contended with over several actions. A lot of things in Daggerheart, you can make one action roll, and on a success, you address that challenge. You overcome whatever the obstacle was. But if something is larger in scale, physically, magically, or like chronally, right? Something that takes a longer period of time, clearing a rockfall avalanche that cut off a tunnel. Maybe that is a progress countdown where you can't just have your guardian go in and make one roll and clear all of it in one go. Maybe for some situations you can, but when you have that larger scale obstacle, a countdown can help you measure that rather than being kind of having to track everything in your head. Probably one of the other biggest takeaways for countdowns is you can use countdowns so that you don't have to track as many things in your head. You put a die down or you write a track or chart on an index card and label it, and you put it out into play. And then the other players help you remember when to advance it based on the triggers, whether that's a standard countdown that ticks down once every time a player takes an action roll, or it's a dynamic countdown that has other factors that make it go up or down. You can use a countdown to kind of condense a whole scene into one set of rolls. Hey, let's do this trip as a progress countdown. Or you are kind of hitting the streets and trying to, gather the information you need to kind of bring evidence to a local magistrate that this person was framed. I might go, this is going to be a progress countdown, and we're going to do this scene as a montage. And every time you make an action roll, that's representing kind of what otherwise might be a whole scene worth of back and forth, but we're condensing it here to do something in a montage. This is a way of controlling pacing as a GM, right? You can take something that might have the chance of kind of sprawling out into several hours of role play and say, we're going to cover this all in a montage with a progress countdown. What are you doing? Oh, well, I want to go talk to my one friend, right? And you can help them condense what that thing is. I'm going to go to an ally and I'm going to ask them for a favor. Okay, great. That sounds like a presence roll. The consequence here might be that your relationship with this friend is strained, or if things don't go well, maybe they don't have information here. The player makes a roll and you apply the result to the progress countdown. And if there's a consequence and you don't have a linked consequence countdown, you come up with a consequence using the normal GM move decision-making matrix. What makes sense in the moment? What consequences had you already imagined? What things might happen as a ripple effect? What might the cost to the character be? Things like that. When I did the seminar this last week, countdowns were one of the topics, and one of the questions was, when do you put a countdown public versus when do you have it like behind the GM screen, or when do you reveal an ongoing countdown? This, for me, is very much a matter of personal taste, your GMing style, but it can also be a pacing mechanism where something that wasn't revealed becomes revealed, and you go, I've been tracking this on a countdown, it's at 3, when it triggers, this thing will happen, right? The player characters uncover a plot that you had been tracking with a long-term countdown. Then you take that countdown that you had been tracking on your own that had been private, and you make it public. So now they see the timer ticking down as well. So you can certainly do that. You can use it as a way to reveal dangers to the players that the characters don't know about, utilizing dramatic irony. In a game that John Harper, designer of Blaze in the Dark and one of the additional designers on Daggerheart, this is a story I didn't hear directly from Harper. I heard somebody else relate it about a game Harper had run, so if it's apocryphal, I apologize. In this scene, the player characters and their crew were talking to a contact, kind of trying to make a deal about something, if I remember correctly. The player characters kind of make their rolls, and Harper says, okay, great, she agrees to do XYZ. The player characters leave, and then Harper puts down a clock, because it's Blades, that says they see through her lies. That is Harper as the GM telling the players she was lying to you about something, but your characters don't know it yet. That move is extremely gutsy and cool. I have not had or taken the opportunity to do something that's that hardcore in terms of relying entirely on dramatic irony with regards to something that's just happened. I did, in a campaign that I'm running right now, introduce a long-term countdown that the player characters had heard a rumor that might relate to it. But in activating the countdown and making it public, I'm telling the players, this is going to happen unless something in the fiction prevents it. And here is how long it's going to be. This is going to be a long-term countdown that ticks down once every time you take a long rest. And that gives the players a bit of a timer on this other threat that is not related to and in a different part of the region from the thing that they're actively trying to do. Countdowns can be used to track character or player projects. In the long-term options for player characters during a long rest, one of the things you can do is work on a project. The project rules are on page 181 of the core rulebook. And there's a few different ways that you resolve like how much progress somebody's going to make on their project for any given action. And different types of projects might call for different options. Something that's really actively dangerous, maybe you ask them to make an action roll when they take that action. And they can make progress toward it like it's a progress countdown, but also there can be consequences. Prince Justin says, that is very hardcore, the Harper story, and relies heavily on players being able to segregate knowledge in character and out of character. Absolutely. I would probably not use a move like that in a group where we had already discussed that they as a group really don't want to metagame if at all possible, right? They want to experience the world almost exclusively through the experiences of the player characters. In a situation like that, I would only reveal a countdown like that once the players realize that something big is happening. And If they really didn't want any information, they might learn about the plot and still not want to know how close the countdown is. They would want to know only through the fiction as it is understood by their player characters, right? If they learn about a plot but they don't know that it's only at 3 of 10, they might start acting against it, but they learned about it too late. As with a lot of things in Daggerheart, this is going to come down to the preferences and style of your group. What did you agree on in session 0? If something related to using countdowns or anything like this comes up and you go, oh, we never really talked about this question of in-character versus out-of-character knowledge. Then, as the GM, I might just say, hey, I want to step out of character real quick. I don't remember us talking about dramatic irony and in-character versus out-of-character knowledge. How do you all feel about me revealing stuff to you as players that your characters don't know about, like with countdowns or something? And then you have like a mini session 0 type discussion. And then when that's established, you can go back into play. Revealing a clock after it went off, right? So here was a ticking time bomb that you didn't know about, and now it has gone off, and then the GM, or in this case MC, reveals it as it takes effect, right? That is a big oh no moment. There's a little bit to which you lose that if you reveal a countdown, but if you reveal a countdown, you also get the dread from the players because they know it's coming. And maybe that will be more fun for them as players and possibly also you as the GM. Okay, so jumping back here to me, long-term countdowns, and this kind of feeds into what I had just been talking about. The book has a section talking about using long-term countdowns. It suggests that you advance one of your long-term countdowns every long rest. I like the practice where you can spend fear to additionally advance other long-term countdowns. Some of this will depend on the scale that these countdowns are operating on. If you look at the 5 Banners Burning campaign frame, there are custom mechanics in that frame that talk about faction projects and faction objectives, very much informed by the way that fronts and faction objectives and faction turns work in Blades in the Dark. Because Harper did it in an amazing way to a great degree, and why reinvent the wheel? So by default, you advance one long-term countdown by 1 point each long rest. But you might want things to go faster than that. So you could spend fear. For me, usually 1 fear is 1 tick on a long-term countdown. I think it's probably fine in almost all cases to be able to spend fear to advance other countdowns. This, the boat is sinking faster than you imagined, right? The volcano goes off early. The guards were closer than you thought, and so they arrive earlier than I had previously suggested they probably would, or earlier than you expected. But because you're using fear, you are acknowledging that you, as the GM, are putting your thumb on the scale, right? That you are bending the fiction toward the result that you're looking for to raise the stakes or complicate things. If you are familiar with fronts from Apocalypse World or Dungeon World or other games that used that kind of front technology or terminology, I think that you can apply a ton of that to long-term planning expressed as long-term countdowns in Daggerheart. There's some sections in the GMing section, the running the adventure section of Daggerheart, that talk about using countdowns to track beats, like bigger story beats. And the thing that I want to give folks to think about with regards to those long-term countdowns manifesting in a way that's kind of similar to or parallel to fronts is with those countdowns, I look for places along the progress of that countdown where the thing that happens at that step along the way is going to be noticeable or is going to end up where the player characters can hear about it, right? Something happens in this progress that will reach the player character's attention so that a long-term project or a front that I want the player characters to be able to contend with and try to stop, they hear about it in time to do something if they respond to it. Now, this doesn't have to necessarily be I reveal information and tell you this is the manifestation of a long-term countdown. I may not be that overt, but I may give them a rumor that connects to a long-term countdown, right? You've heard rumors of additional bandit raids along the coast and the border between this nation and some other nation. And then 4 or 5 sessions later, when the countdown has progressed farther, I might then say through a player character, through a non-player character, like, oh yeah, I just came from Ebenhold. It got taken over by bandits, right? The whole town got raided and the mayor surrendered. They killed the sheriff. Like, oh, I heard rumors about bandits. We heard rumors about bandits last week, but this seems to really be escalating. Alan Tucker says, having antagonists who have a specific agenda in a campaign are key to making the world seem alive and engaging. Absolutely, right? You can be tracking that by individuals, right? The BBEG has projects. This could be factions having projects. Allied factions could have projects and long-term countdowns in pursuit of their own agendas, but maybe the process of trying to do that creates new complications, or you're just using it to keep track of how the world is advancing so that you don't have to keep everything in your head all the time. Externalizing a little bit of that processing and systematizing it into long-term countdowns can help you keep that world ticking along, right? Keep time moving forward so that the world feels alive and active while you are more zoomed in on whatever's happening around the player characters. And then you can refer to those countdowns when they would create something that then impacts or ends up on screen with the player characters. So, before I get to my final tips, I want to hit a couple of special countdown rules that are in the book and that you might find useful in some situations. Some features on adversaries will have a countdown that activates at a random value. So countdown 1d6. That means that the length of this countdown is variable, and a lot of those countdowns are standard countdowns. So if you roll a countdown 1d6 and it's a standard countdown, you roll it, it activates at 1, and then it would trigger after the next player makes an action roll. So if you want a little bit more randomness in how often something happens that you use a countdown for, you can use a die. The trick there is that you are going to get fairly variable results if you are using a larger die, right? A 1d6, 5 additional actions can be a big part of a scene, could be a whole scene really. So you might use a 1d4 or you might use 2d4. If a countdown is representing something really big across a whole scene or a sequence, having it be variable might not be optimal because you might want that scope. You might want the breadth of the scene. You might want the scene or sequence to stretch out for a while. So maybe in that case, you don't want to use a randomized activation like level, right? It activates at 5 because I rolled a 5 on the D6. But it's there as an option. And if you want to lean into that randomness, you can let the die decide. And this is also something in the core books. Some countdowns are loop countdowns. Loop countdowns are things that will trigger multiple times over and over. So if you had a countdown that was every 5 action rolls, the volcano is going to spew up like a gout of lava. Well, that might be a countdown that is a loop 5. It starts at 5, it goes down, it triggers at 0, and then because it is a loop, you reset it to start at 5 again, and then it counts down, and then it triggers again. A loop countdown is great for something that you would expect to happen several times over the course of a scene, and that it will happen at a consistent rate, right? It will happen every so often. Every 3 actions you take, more reinforcements are going to show up. That's a countdown 3 that loops. Now you can have loops that increase and you can have loops that decrease. An increasing loop would be something that happens less frequently and less frequently and less frequently. Okay, so there's some guards nearby, so in 3 turns, guards will show up. But then it's going to take another 4 turns for more guards to show up because the loop will have gone from 3 to 1 trigger. And because it's an increasing loop, when it resets, you add 1 to that starting value. It resets to 4 instead of 3. And then it goes 4, 3, 2, 1 trigger, and then it resets to 5. So this is something that becomes less frequent as it recurs. You might use a increasing loop for an adversary's powerful feature, right? As they use it, it gets harder and harder for them to build up the stamina to use it again, or maybe they're tapping into magic, and so it takes them longer to gather the magic. On the opposite end, a decreasing loop is something that gets more and more frequent. A decreasing loop 3, you start at 3, 2, 1, trigger, and then when you reset it to 2 because you're decreasing from 3, and then it goes 2, 1, trigger, and then it resets to 1, and then it triggers. Things that are decreasing loops will tend to have an extra note that says when this countdown resets to 0, some additional thing happens. So if I was going to do a decreasing loop countdown while the player characters are escaping from an ancient tomb of like a warrior from a long ago age, and I'm drawing on something like the Mummy, right? I go, okay, here is a decreasing countdown 4. Every time this triggers, parts of the building are going to collapse in, and everybody's going to have to make reaction rolls to avoid getting pummeled by the stone of this collapsing building. And because this is a decreasing countdown, it's going to get more and more common. I then, if I want to be really clear with the players, I say, when this countdown resets to 0, you are all trapped inside this ancient tomb, and you're not going to be able to escape, right? Or you're going to have to find another way to escape. That reset to 0 is usually something that has finality or has a big escalation. So if you have like a magic ritual that says, okay, when this ritual triggers, some monsters are going to come through the portal. If you make it a decreasing loop, the monsters are going to come more and more frequently. And then maybe if the loop resets to 0, you say, when the loop resets to 0, this portal to the circles below is permanently open until somebody does a big ritual to close it, and monsters are just going to stream through forever. Right? You've lost the chance to close it before it's fully opened. The type of consequence or GM move that you make with a loop resetting to 0, you may often go to the move that is they lose an opportunity permanently. Right? If you want a really strong move, you want finality, think about a move that manifests in that way. Okay. I've got just a few more tips on countdowns. And then if anybody who is here as we're going has questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat, And if not, then we'll have a nice, quick, efficient stream, and everyone can get on to the rest of what they're doing with their day. Pulling back and reviewing countdowns in summary, right? Countdowns are an optional tool in a lot of ways. They are built into some features and adversaries and things, but how much you use countdowns and how you use countdowns is really up to you. I love using countdowns to measure and track larger objectives. I like in a tense social situation or in a place where the group is trying to accomplish something before some bad thing happens. There, I am likely to use linked countdowns, a progress countdown toward what they want to do, and a consequence countdown that represents the bad thing that might happen along the way, or if they're not able to do this thing that they want to do fast enough. And then when I have these linked countdowns, I use that dynamic countdown advancement chart that's in the SRD and in the core rulebook, so that when the players are making rolls, that tells me which countdown to advance by how much. Most of the time in those situations, the consequences from rolls are going to be focused on that consequence countdown rather than me ticking down the countdown and having something else apply. But progress toward that countdown triggering can and usually should have some manifestation in the fiction, which will naturally change the status quo of the scene because the bad thing is getting closer, or a bad process is playing out toward a flashpoint, right? That trigger of whatever the consequence countdown creates when it triggers. If you are looking for a place to use fear, you can use fear to escalate or press fast forward a little bit on a countdown towards something bad. Prince Justin asks, have you ever used gear tooth countdowns where a countdown counting down to 0 is the trigger for a bigger scale countdown? I have not used those often, but I think it's a perfectly solid way of doing things. The thing that this brings up for me is there is a point at which you can have so many countdowns going that you lose track of them, and they add to cognitive load rather than lightening it. That's not automatically going to happen for a gear tooth countdown, but something that I do use is I break a larger project or a larger plot action into smaller countdowns. Okay, if you want to do this magical project, I think this is going to be several countdowns. The first project is identify the problem. The second project is figure out a solution. The third project is apply the solution and basically complete or address the problem. I could have that be one really large countdown, but by breaking it up into pieces, I am more easily signaling the key beats in this overall process. This part of it is about researching the problem, and that helps me hone in on what the consequences might be. And for everybody at the table to understand, okay, but what's happening in the fiction as you do this beyond just this countdown progressing towards 0? To a certain extent, that type of linked countdown plays some similar roles to what a gear tooth countdown does. If you were playing a 5 Banners Burning campaign or something with a lot of faction projects, then I think considering a gear tooth countdown might be a really good idea, where something happens in a scene that the player characters are confronting, and you say, hey, so if this consequence countdown in the scene triggers, I'm going to tick this faction's project countdown because completing this is a step toward this bigger project that they have. And that gives the specific fictional moment a larger mechanical and fictional manifestation. And we're using that larger term countdown to track a big fictional element, which comes back to another thing that I want to emphasize, and that is that countdowns should have a fictional analog. And for me, they are just a way of being really clear about what it's going to take, how long it's going to take for some fictional thing to happen or complete. If I have a countdown for the demon summoning ritual, I'm going to express the ritual as things progress because I want to begin and end with the fiction. I want to help players understand the relationship between a countdown and what is happening in the fiction so that they understand that that countdown is a representation of the thing that's happening in the fiction, not a replacement for something happening in the fiction. Additionally, using countdowns that the player characters are aware of is a way of giving something emphasis, right? In fiction, whatever you spend words on is getting emphasis for the reader in the story or in the narration. In GMing, what I, the GM, spend my time talking about or emphasizing, that emphasis passes on to the players. If I say that something has a countdown, there is a strong degree to which I, as the GM, am implicitly saying, this is important enough for me to keep track of. And that may signal to the player characters that something is important enough for them to keep track of. Now, you can absolutely have countdowns for silly things. But in that case, you are emphasizing the amusement of the silly thing, right? Depending on the tone of your game. And that, I think, is all of my thoughts for now on countdowns for the stream. Right? I could go on. We could do a bunch of examples. I could pull out the core book and walk all the way through one of those longer term countdowns that's like a front. But I think for today, we are going to leave it there. Unless anybody has any questions. If you have not already done so, I would encourage folks to go on to my Patreon. Patreon is the first best place to support my work in creating resources for and supplemental material for use with the rules of Daggerheart. My Patreon has new classes that are works in progress that I'm working on, adversaries, environments. I have a cool deck builder subsystem that I've been playing with. All of my creator-owned projects for Daggerheart compatible material, they're going to show up on that Patreon in some way, shape, or form, unless they need to be secret for some other reason. Freelancing projects that I'm doing for some other company, those are going to almost always come with an NDA, and so I can't put stuff onto the Patreon. Those we'll have to hear about when the company announces it or when I've been given leave to announce it. Prince Justin is referring to the most recent post on my Patreon, which is some news about my now departed dog Oreo, who we had to say goodbye to last week. So you can read that there. I will just refer to it here rather than dwell on it, because if I do, I will get very sad, because it was a heartbreaking loss, and he will be in our memory for all time. He was a wonderful, goofy dog, and I miss him a lot. But there's a bunch of other stuff on the Patreon. It's certainly not only, big life news like that. There's a bunch of other stuff, and it's a great way of hearing about streams and other projects that I'm working on. So thank you to everybody who joined me today on stream, that being including, but not limited to, Prince Justin, Alan Tucker, Sangre00, Pathfinder PhD, and The Kids Are Asleep, and everybody else who was hanging out. And thank you to folks who are watching on YouTube later on. That's going to be all for today, and now I'm going to go to my ending thing. Take care. See ya.